They never found all of him. That's where this one starts. Not with a date, not with a company name, with a foreman's report from a Pennsylvania steel mill, filed in the kind of flat language men use when they need to keep working the same day someone died 10 feet from them. A worker fell into the runner, the trench that carries molten iron straight from the furnace's mouth, 2,800 degrees. He was there and then he wasn't, and the men who pulled the next shift just kept pouring, because the iron doesn't wait, and neither did the company. That happened more than once, in more than one furnace, in more than one Pennsylvania town whose name you've probably never said out loud. Here's the thing nobody tells you about a blast furnace. It never stops. Not for lunch, not for a death, not for a funeral. Once you light it, it runs for years, sometimes a decade, without going cold. Because going cold means rebuilding it from the lining out, and that costs more than most of these towns were worth. So when a man went into the iron kept moving. There was no stopping the machine to grieve. There was barely time to write it down. And right now, today, this week, some of those exact furnaces are still standing, empty, rusted through, open to the sky in places where the roof gave out 20 years ago. You can walk up to them in certain parts of Pennsylvania, and there's nothing stopping you but a chain-link fence and a sign that hasn't been updated since the Clinton administration. They're not relics behind glass. They're not preserved the way a battlefield is preserved, with plaques and a gift shop. Some of them just got left there, the way you'd leave a dead car in a field, except this dead car is 15 stories tall, lined with brick that's still radiating decades-old heat in places, and built specifically to swallow men whole when it failed. This is the story of the machines that did that, what they were built to beat, what it actually felt like to stand next to one when it went wrong, and why, of all the things Pennsylvania could have torn down after the steel died, these monsters are the ones still standing, silent, rusting, and somehow still capable of killing the people curious enough to climb inside them. We're going to come back to the names, the ones who didn't walk away. Hold on to that. And before we move on, if this kind of history matters to you, please subscribe and hit the like button. It keeps this channel alive. Thank you. Because what's still standing in those fields isn't finished with people yet. The facts that don't belong in a history book. Start here. A single blast furnace, fully loaded and running, held enough molten iron and gas pressure to kill every man within 50 feet of it in under 4 seconds. Not eventually. 4 seconds. That's not a number from a safety manual written to scare you. That's the time it took for a Pennsylvania furnace explosion to go from a hairline crack in a tuyere to a wall of fire wide enough to take out a work crew standing where they'd been ordered to stand minutes before. Steelworkers had a name for the moment a furnace stopped behaving. They called it hanging. The material inside, the ore, the coke, the limestone, was supposed to flow downward in a slow, steady column, like sand through an hourglass that took 10 hours to empty. When it stopped flowing and jammed instead, the gas pressure underneath kept building with nowhere to go. And the fix for a hanging furnace, in the era before anyone cared enough to engineer it away, was to send men up to the top, on foot, onto a structure that was, at that exact moment, sitting on top of a bomb. It killed them in batches. 3 men dead instantly in one furnace blast. 11 more injured, 3 of those fatally before the week was out. That's not one bad day, at one unlucky mill. That's the kind of math that repeated itself across the Pennsylvania steel belt for the better part of a century, mill after mill, town after town, and barely made the newspaper unless the death toll was high enough to embarrass somebody. Here's the one that should stop you cold. An 8-year-old boy died at a Pennsylvania area blast furnace operation. Cooked alive after falling into a vat the company hadn't bothered to fence off. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He was. Nobody was charged. A 12-year-old boy caught fire when a piece of red-hot iron burned straight through his thigh and into his clothing. He survived. Barely. Nobody explained to his family why a child that age was close enough to molten metal to be set on fire by it. These furnaces didn't just kill the men who ran them. For a long stretch of Pennsylvania's industrial history, they killed children who wandered too close, and the companies that owned them treated it the way you'd treat a dog that bit someone. Unfortunate, regrettable, and not worth changing anything over. And then there's the fact that ties all of this together, the one this entire video exists to answer. Some of the exact furnaces responsible for these deaths are not gone. They were not demolished, not scrapped, not buried under a parking lot like almost everything else from that era. A handful of them, towering, rusted, completely dead, are still standing in Pennsylvania fields right now, fenced off but visible, decaying in real time, while the rest of the industry that built them vanished into history books. We'll come back to that. It's the reason this video exists. Workers had nicknames for these machines, and the nicknames weren't affectionate. Some called the worst of them widowmakers, the way you'd name a horse that had thrown one too many riders. The companies never used that word in a press release. They used it in the break room, between men who knew exactly which furnace on the property had taken the most lives, and which crew you didn't want to draw for the night shift. A blast furnace in full operation moved roughly 4 tons of coal-derived fuel through its body every single hour, fed by hand and machine into a structure radiating heat you could feel from across a parking lot. The air blown into its base to keep that fire alive was preheated to nearly 2,000 degrees before it ever touched the coke. 2,000 degrees of forced air, blasted continuously, 24 hours a day, into a sealed steel cylinder lined with brick. And that's before you account for what happens when the chemistry inside goes wrong. So how does something built to run non-stop, fed by hand, packed with men working 12-hour shifts, next to enough stored thermal energy to level a city block, how does that not kill someone every single week? It did. For a long time, it basically did. We'll get to how it actually worked. We'll get to the men who ran it, the disaster that became the textbook example of everything that could go wrong, and exactly what's sitting in those Pennsylvania fields today, still standing, still dangerous, decades after the last fire went out. But first, you need to understand what these things were built to defeat, because nobody builds something this violent by accident. The iron problem Pennsylvania couldn't walk away from. Before the blast furnace, turning rock into usable iron was slow, small, and almost gentle by comparison. Bloomeries and small charcoal furnaces produced iron in batches measured in pounds, not tons, consuming whole forests of charcoal to do it. America in the early 1800s needed rails, cannons, bridges, and eventually skyscrapers. What it had was a process that couldn't scale past the size of a blacksmith shop. Western Pennsylvania had the one thing that made the difference: coal. Specifically, coal that could be baked into coke, a harder, hotter-burning fuel that could survive the crushing weight of a furnace stacked with ore above it without collapsing into useless dust. Pair that coal with the iron ore arriving by river and rail, and Pittsburgh and the towns strung along the Monongahela and the Lehigh had every raw ingredient sitting within a few dozen miles of each other. The problem wasn't access. The problem was getting all of it to react, continuously, at a scale nobody had attempted before. The men who solved it didn't build a bigger version of the old furnace. They built something closer to a controlled, continuous explosion, a vertical steel cylinder, sometimes pushing 15 stories tall, lined with refractory brick, thick enough to survive temperatures that would liquefy the steel shell around it if the brick ever failed. Ore, coke, and limestone went in at the top in measured layers. Superheated air got forced in at the bottom under pressure. And somewhere in the middle of that column, chemistry that had taken metallurgists decades to understand turned solid rock into liquid metal, continuously, for years at a stretch, without the furnace ever fully shutting down. Before this technology matured, producing a ton of usable iron could eat up days of labor and a small mountain of charcoal. After it, a single furnace could turn out over 1,000 tons of iron in a single day, fed non-stop by crews working around the clock. That's not an improvement. That's an entirely different category of machine. And the men who built the first ones in Pennsylvania weren't running tests in a lab. They were lighting fires inside untested steel shells and finding out, in real time, what happened when the chemistry didn't behave. The newspapers that covered the early ironworks treated each successful blast like a minor miracle, proof that men could bend rock into liquid on command. What those same newspapers rarely covered, at least not on the front page, was what happened on the days the furnace didn't cooperate. Because the moment you build something that runs hot, fast, and continuously, you've also built something that fails, hot, fast, and continuously. The furnace didn't care that nobody had figured out yet how to make it safe. It only cared about the chemistry, and the chemistry didn't negotiate. That's debt number one paid back. The 8-year-old, the 12-year-old, the men killed in batches. That all traces back to companies racing to scale up a process faster than anyone understood how to control it. We'll keep paying these debts down as we go. There are more. The mills that rose up around these furnaces didn't pick their locations by accident either. Braddock, Homestead, Bethlehem, towns that didn't exist in any meaningful sense before the furnace arrived, and that would not have survived in any recognizable form after it left. Andrew Carnegie bought into the Homestead works and built an empire on the back of furnaces just like these. Furnaces that, decades later, would still be standing in a field while everything else Carnegie built turned to rubble or condos. But scale alone wasn't the hard part. The hard part was making 4 tons of fuel an hour, 2,000-degree air, and a 15-story column of molten rock behave itself for 10 straight hours without killing the men standing closest to it. That fight, the one between the engineers and the chemistry, and the one between the companies and the cost of doing it safely, is where this story gets its teeth. What it took to make the beast behave, and what happened when it didn't. Picture the furnace as a 15-story digestive system, and you're not far off. At the very top, a mechanism called a double bell, 2 interlocking hatches, stacked one above the other, let workers dump in iron ore, coke, and limestone without letting the furnace gas escape and without letting outside air rush in and disrupt the chemistry below. Get that timing wrong, even slightly, and you weren't just wasting material. You were inviting an uncontrolled mixture of gas and oxygen to find each other inside a sealed steel chamber, which is the exact recipe for an explosion. That charge, the ore, coke, and limestone, descended slowly through the furnace's body over roughly 10 hours, sinking through zones that got progressively hotter the deeper it traveled. Near the bottom, nozzles called tuyères forced in a continuous blast of air, preheated to somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, to keep the coke burning at the kind of temperature that could tear oxygen away from iron ore and leave pure liquid metal behind. That hot blast didn't just need to be hot, it needed to be relentless. Stop it, even briefly, and the entire 10-hour column of material above it could cool, harden, and seize, turning a working furnace into a multi-story plug of solid rock that had to be physically broken apart by men standing inside the danger zone. This is the part the mechanics never separate from the danger, because they can't. The furnace had to run hot enough to liquefy stone, under enough pressure to force gas through 15 stories of packed material, fed continuously by men working in heat that could blister skin through clothing. And it had to do all of that without ever fully stopping, because stopping and restarting a blast furnace from cold could take weeks and cost more than most companies were willing to spend. So when something went wrong inside that column, when the burden stopped descending evenly and instead jammed into a hanging mass with pressurized gas trapped beneath it, there was no safe way to fix it from a distance. Someone had to climb to the top of a structure sitting on stored energy equivalent to a controlled bomb and physically break the blockage loose. Sometimes that meant prodding it with iron bars. Sometimes it meant detonating small explosive charges to shatter the jam, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds when you're standing on top of the thing you're trying to blow apart. And when the hanging mass let go all at once, what workers called a slip, 15 stories of material that had been holding back pressurized, superheated gas suddenly gave way in an instant. The gas didn't have anywhere gentle to go. It came up through the same opening the men were standing next to. 3 men killed instantly, 11 more injured, 3 of those fatally within days. That's the documented outcome of one furnace slip at one Pennsylvania mill. And it wasn't a freak occurrence. It was a known, named failure mode, with its own vocabulary, its own warning signs, and its own body count, decade after decade. Here's the part that should make you angry instead of just afraid. The standard procedure when a furnace was known to be hanging was for the furnace keeper to order the blast reduced or shut off entirely before sending anyone near it. That procedure existed. It was written down. And on the day this particular slip happened, it wasn't followed, because an ore buggy had tipped at the top of the furnace, spilling its load, and instead of waiting for the danger to pass, the foreman sent 12 men up to right it while the furnace was still hanging. 12 men, sent up to fix a spill on top of a structure everyone on site already knew was unstable. Nobody ever fully explained why the order to wait got overridden that day. The men who survived didn't get an answer. The families of the men who didn't survive got even less. That's the moment this story turns from mechanics into something else entirely. Because a machine that kills you when the chemistry fails is a tragedy. A machine that kills you because someone decided the spilled ore mattered more than the standard safety procedure, that's a choice. And choices like that one didn't happen once. They happened across Pennsylvania, across decades, inside furnace after furnace, every time the cost of doing it right got weighed against the cost of doing it fast. That's what it actually took to make this beast produce iron at a scale no one had managed before. Not just engineering, a continuous, ongoing negotiation between speed and survival. One the companies running these furnaces did not always settle in favor of the men standing closest to the fire. The men who lived inside the heat. Knowing how a blast furnace worked on paper tells you almost nothing about what it cost to stand next to one for a 12-hour shift, 6 days a week, for years. The heat alone was enough to break a man down. Workers stationed near the tapping area, where the furnace was periodically opened to let molten iron pour out into waiting cars, worked close enough to 2,000+ degree liquid metal that protective gear of the era amounted to little more than heavy cloth and instinct. Men learned to read the color of the iron, the sound of the gas, the specific smell that meant a tap was about to go wrong, because that instinct was often the only warning system they had. There was no sensor doing that job for them. There was no automated shutoff. There was a man, standing close enough to be killed by what he was watching, trusting his own eyes more than any piece of equipment the company had given him. The job didn't reward caution. It rewarded speed, because a furnace that wasn't producing was a furnace losing the company money every hour it sat idle. So crews worked fast, in heat that could exceed 120 degrees near the furnace face, breathing air thick with gas and particulate that settled into their lungs and stayed there for the rest of their lives, whether or not the furnace ever directly injured them. One former mill worker, decades later, put it plainly. Life in these mills was a terrible life. Men were ground down to scrap and thrown out as wreckage. He wasn't speaking poetically. He was describing the literal arithmetic of the job, that a man's body, like the iron ore feeding the furnace above him, was treated as raw material to be consumed and replaced. That replacement was the point. There was no shortage of immigrant labor flooding into Pennsylvania's mill towns in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Russians, arriving by the thousands, willing to take the most dangerous furnace floor positions because those were the only jobs being offered to men who didn't yet speak English. A worker injured or killed on a Tuesday could often be replaced by Thursday. Nobody needed to fix the furnace's danger when the labor pool refilled itself faster than the injuries piled up. In Braddock, Pennsylvania, a Slovak immigrant family lived this exact arithmetic in real time. A young furnace worker named Joe Dubik died in an explosion at the Braddock blast furnaces, leaving behind a wife who had to rebuild a life with nothing but a small insurance payout and a community of other furnace widows who understood exactly what had happened without needing it explained. Years later, in the same family, a furnace worker named Mike Dobrachak was killed in what his family was told was a suspicious accident on a night shift, details that were never fully clarified to the people who needed them most. And the author who eventually wrote the family's story down, a man named Thomas Bell, lost an uncle the same way nearly every furnace town lost someone. Poison gas from a furnace, age 32, gone. These weren't isolated tragedies that happened to one unlucky family. They were the standard outcome of working a Pennsylvania blast furnace for long enough. Bell's own father started as a steel worker in these same mills before transitioning out, and even then, tuberculosis from the mill environment caught up with him before old age could. The furnace killed people who never even got close enough to be standing in the blast radius. It killed them slowly. Through the air they breathed every single shift, long after their 12 hours next to the tap hole had ended for the day. If you've stayed this long, you already know more about what these furnaces actually cost than most people who've walked past Carrie Furnace or stood at steel stacks in Bethlehem ever bother to learn. Not the postcard version. The version where an 8-year-old burned to death in a vat nobody fenced off, and a furnace keeper's safety order got overridden because a spilled buggy of ore seemed more urgent than 12 men's lives. I've spent a long time with the accident reports from these mills. The thing that stays with me isn't the explosions. It's how routine they read on the page, filed the same way you'd file a broken machine part, because to the company, that's essentially what had happened. A part had failed. The part just happened to have a name, and a wife, and 4 kids waiting at home for a shift that was never going to end the way it was supposed to. The companies that owned these furnaces understood the danger completely. They employed engineers who studied failure modes, who knew exactly what a hanging furnace could do, who had the data on how many men a slip could kill in under 5 seconds. What they didn't have for most of this era was any meaningful financial incentive to slow production down in order to protect the workforce running it. That's the part that turns a danger story into something colder. Because the men who died weren't victims of ignorance. They were victims of a calculation, one where their lives were a cost the company had already decided it could afford to pay. And we still haven't answered the question this whole video opened on. If these companies knew, if the danger was documented, if the deaths were treated as routine, how is it possible that the exact machines responsible for all of this are still standing in Pennsylvania today? Not demolished, not erased, just left there, rusting, like nobody could decide whether they were a monument or a crime scene. We're getting there. But first, you need to see the day it all came apart completely. The disaster that, more than any other, became the reason an entire industry could no longer pretend this was acceptable. The day the furnace took everything it could reach. Every blast furnace town in Pennsylvania had its own version of this day. The details changed, the year, the company, the specific names of the dead, but the shape of the disaster repeated itself with almost mechanical consistency, because the underlying failure was always some version of the same thing: a furnace under pressure, a warning sign ignored, and men sent in close enough to pay for that decision with their bodies. Take the hanging furnace slip already described, the one where 12 men were sent up to fix a spilled ore buggy while the furnace was already known to be unstable. Walk through what that actually looked like from the ground. The order to lower the blast had been the standard procedure. Everyone on shift would have known it. The furnace keeper, the man whose entire job was reading the furnace's behavior and making the call on when it was too dangerous to approach, had the authority to stop production cold the moment he suspected a hang. That authority existed specifically because the company understood, on paper, exactly how lethal an unstable furnace could be. But production losses from a full shutdown were measured in real money. Every single hour the furnace sat idle instead of pouring iron. So when the spill happened at the top, 500 pounds of stock tipped over and threatening to jam the charging mechanism further, the calculation that mattered in that moment wasn't, "Is this safe?" It was, "How fast can we get this fixed without losing the whole shift's output?" 12 men climbed. 2 were stationed specifically to watch the ore buggy and make sure the stock slipped down evenly. The other 10 worked around them, manually righting the spilled load on a structure that was, underneath their boots, holding back gas pressure that had nowhere to vent except up through the exact opening they were standing beside. The hang broke, not gradually, all at once, the way these things almost always happen, because that's the physics of it. 15 stories of jammed material let go in a fraction of a second, and the pressurized gas trapped beneath it found the fastest path out, which happened to be straight up through the men working the top of the furnace. 3 were killed instantly. The blast tore through the iron canopy above the furnace top, the protective structure that was supposed to shield workers from exactly this kind of event, and ripped it loose like it was nothing more than tin roofing. 11 more were injured in the same instant, 3 of them badly enough that they didn't survive the week. The mill didn't shut down. It couldn't. The same furnace, repaired and relit, was producing iron again within days, because a furnace town's entire economy depended on that fire staying lit, and grief was not a line item anyone had budgeted for. This is the pattern that repeated, with variations, across nearly every Pennsylvania mill town that ran blast furnaces for more than a few decades. A boiler explosion at a Mahoning Valley furnace killed 2 laborers and severely injured 5 others when the structure failed under pressure the company had been warned about. A roller at a nearby rolling mill was crippled for life when rainwater made unexpected contact with exposed molten iron, triggering an explosion nobody had planned for because nobody had bothered to weatherproof the exposure point. None of these were freak accidents in the truest sense. Every one of them traced back to a known risk that had been identified, documented, and left unaddressed because addressing it cost more than the company wanted to spend. Nobody was ever criminally charged for the deaths at most of these furnaces. The investigations, where they happened at all, typically concluded with some version of industrial accident, language specific enough to close the file, vague enough to assign no blame to anyone standing above the furnace keeper on the org chart. The men who died went into the company's books as a production interruption. The families who survived them went into the surrounding town's economy as one more household now dependent on a single insurance payout, and whatever work a widow or an 11-year-old son could scrape together, collecting coal and wood to sell on weekends. This was not the cost of doing business in some abstract sense. This was the actual line-item cost of doing business, paid in bodies, decade after decade, until the furnaces themselves finally went cold, not because anyone decided the danger had to end, but because something else entirely was coming for these mills. Something that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with money. We'll get to that. But first, sit with this. Some of these exact furnaces, the ones that did this, are still standing today, where the beasts sleep now. By the late 1970s, the same Pennsylvania mills that had run nonstop for a century, killing men in batches and barely pausing to record their names, were dying, and not for the reasons you'd expect. It wasn't safety regulation that finally slowed these furnaces down, though OSHA's founding in 1971 did force real changes after decades of nothing. It was money. Foreign steel producers in Japan and West Germany had rebuilt their industries from the ground up after the war, with modern basic oxygen furnaces and newer technology that Pennsylvania's century-old blast furnaces simply couldn't match on cost or efficiency. American steel companies had spent decades reinvesting in expansion instead of modernization, and by the time the 1973 oil crisis and the recessions that followed hit the industry, the math had already turned against them. The collapse, when it came, was not gradual. In the Pittsburgh region alone, roughly 150,000 steel mill workers lost their jobs in the early 1980s. Between 1980 and 1983, another 95,000 manufacturing jobs vanished from the surrounding economy as the ripple effect tore through suppliers, railroads, and the small businesses that had depended on mill paychecks for generations. By the end of that decade, 3/4 of Pittsburgh's steel-making capacity had been shuttered outright. By 1990, roughly half the region's population was simply gone, moved away to chase work that no longer existed where they'd grown up. Bethlehem Steel, once the second-largest steel producer in the country, reported a loss of $1.5 billion in 1982 alone, the kind of number that doesn't get absorbed. It gets answered with closures. The company limped on for another 2 decades, shedding workers and shutting furnaces one by one, until its flagship Bethlehem plant rolled out its last steel on November 18, 1995. Witnesses who were there that day described a steelworker whistling "Amazing Grace" over the plant's loudspeaker as the final pour went out. Men who had worked that mill for decades hugged each other and cried, because they understood they were standing inside the last few minutes of something that had defined their entire lives, and that most of them would never see each other again once the gates closed for good. Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2001 and formally dissolved in 2003. Its pension obligations were so large that the Federal Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation had to absorb them in what remains one of the largest pension takeovers in American history. And even then, many retirees lost roughly half of what they'd been promised after a lifetime standing next to furnaces that had already taken pieces of their health they'd never get back. This is where the title of this video stops being a hook and starts being a literal description of a place you can drive to. The Bethlehem Steel plant's 5 blast furnaces were not demolished. Furnaces A through E, the largest of them built in 1954, blown out for the final time in the early 1990s, were simply left standing where they'd always stood, because demolishing structures of that size cost more money than a bankrupt company had left to spend. For years, they sat exactly as the last shift had left them, rusting in the open air along the Lehigh River, visible from the highway, fenced off but never torn down. They're still there right now. Today, in 2026, you can stand in what's now called Steel Stacks, an arts and entertainment complex built directly in the shadow of those same 5 furnaces, and watch a concert with the exact machines that helped kill an unknown number of men towering silently behind the stage. The fires have been out for over 30 years. The furnaces haven't moved. The company that built them and ran them and buried men in their service doesn't exist anymore. The furnaces outlasted it. Outside Pittsburgh, the story repeats with a different cast of characters. The Homestead Steelworkers, built on the same Carnegie Frick foundation that produced one of the bloodiest labor confrontations in American history, when armed guards clashed with striking workers in 1892, was almost entirely demolished after the mill closed in 1986, torn down to make way for a shopping center and a water park. Almost entirely, 2 furnaces, numbered 6 and 7, were left standing on the far side of the Monongahela River, largely because they were too remote and too structurally entangled with the surrounding rail infrastructure to bother tearing down cheaply. Those 2 furnaces, known together as Carrie Furnace, are now the only pre-World War II blast furnaces left standing anywhere in the Pittsburgh region, 92 feet tall, built from steel plate 2.5 inches thick, lined with the same refractory brick that once held back temperatures hot enough to liquefy stone. For years after the mill closed, they sat completely unsecured. Anyone willing to hike through an overgrown employee parking lot and climb an embankment could walk straight up to them and disappear inside the structure that had killed an untold number of men decades earlier. That's not metaphor. That's the literal physical condition these furnaces were left in. No fence, no warning sign that meant anything. Just 2 15-story machines, built to consume coke and ore and men in roughly equal disregard, standing open and accessible in a field outside Pittsburgh for the better part of 2 decades. In 2005, Allegheny County finally purchased the property. A year later, Carrie Furnace's 6 and 7 were designated a National Historic Landmark. The same year, a tour company began offering guided walks through the structure, requiring every visitor to sign a liability waiver acknowledging the risk of injury or death from the site's remaining hazards. Read that again. A waiver, in the 21st century, for a tourist attraction. Because the danger never actually left. The furnace doesn't know its company went bankrupt. It doesn't know the men who ran it are mostly dead now too, of black lung or cancer or simply old age. The structure is still exactly as lethal, physically, as it was in 1950. Corroded steel that can give way underfoot, drop-offs with no railing, brick linings that can collapse without warning. The only thing that's changed is that nobody's getting paid to stand inside it anymore. This is the machine the title of this video is talking about. Not a metaphor for industrial decline, an actual, physical, still-standing structure that burned men alive in its operational decades and is now sitting quietly in a field, waiting for the next person curious enough to climb inside it and find out the hard way that rust doesn't make something safe. It just makes it quiet. What replaced these furnaces, technically, was newer technology. Electric arc mini-mills that didn't need a 15-story column of molten rock running continuously for a decade to produce steel. And that could be built and operated at a fraction of the cost with a fraction of the workforce. What replaced the towns that depended on these furnaces was, for most of them, very little. Braddock, Pennsylvania, the town at the center of the Dubik and Dobrachak family's story, fell from a peak population of nearly 21,000 people down to roughly 2,000. A drop of almost 90%. The furnace that killed Joe Dubik in an explosion outlived not just him, but very nearly his entire town. There's a kind of cruelty in what's left standing versus what's gone. The mansions Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick built with the profits from these furnaces are mostly preserved today, turned into museums and university buildings, polished and air-conditioned, and presented as the proud architecture of American ambition. The furnaces where the men who made that wealth possible actually died are rusting in open fields, accessible mostly to graffiti artists, paranormal investigators chasing ghost stories, and the occasional film crew. One production literally used the abandoned Carrie Furnace as a filming location for a movie about a dying Pennsylvania steel town, shooting its final scenes inside the exact structure that had helped create the economic collapse the film was depicting. Nobody planned this as a memorial. That's the part that should sit with you longest. These furnaces aren't standing because Pennsylvania decided the men who died inside them deserved a monument. They're standing because tearing down a 15-story steel and brick structure costs more money than anyone wanted to spend, on a piece of land nobody had a better use for yet. The preservation came later, almost as an accident. Allegheny County buying land it didn't know what else to do with. A casino corporation in Bethlehem agreeing to leave the furnaces up because tearing them down would have meant losing the one thing that made their property recognizable from the highway. The men who burned, who suffocated, who fell into runners of molten iron and were never fully recovered. They didn't get a museum built in their honor. They got something stranger. They got the machine that killed them, left standing by accident, slowly rusting into a tourist attraction that requires a liability waiver to enter. That's not justice. It's not quite memory either. It's just what happens when nobody bothers to finish tearing something down. They don't make furnaces like that anymore. Not because anyone learned a lesson about the men inside them, because the economics changed, and the iron stopped being worth what it used to cost. The machines that are left are not relics of triumph. They're not relics of mourning either. They're just standing there, rusted and silent, in fields across Pennsylvania, exactly where they were left the day the fire finally went out. Still capable, even now, of taking a hand or a foot or a life from anyone careless enough to forget that quiet isn't the same thing as safe. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the furnaces, and not the men who had no choice but to stand next to them.